800 candles. 800 witnesses. One woman standing at the end of the aisle in white. Breathing like she had practiced breathing for 15 years. Carefully, quietly, taking up as little air as possible. King Selim did not look at her when he reached for Lady Seraphine's hand. He looked at her only once, after the official had spoken, after the hall had exhaled its collective relief. After the words had been said and the choice had been made and nothing remained but the courtesy of dismissal. He turned his head. He met her eyes. And he said, in a voice perfectly calibrated to carry to the front rows without effort, "You are released from your presentation. You may go." 800 people heard it. Lyra breathed once. Then she unclenched something she had been holding for 15 years, a warmth, a living warmth. Pressed so deep inside her chest it had almost become part of the bone, and she simply let it go. She turned. She walked. The first Solaris Veil flower bloomed where her heel met the marble floor. Then another. Then another. By the time she reached the great oak doors and pushed them open without looking back, a trail of impossible silver-white blossoms stretched the full length of the ceremonial aisle, glowing softly in the candlelight, alive and luminous and utterly unmistakable. The doors swung shut. The trail remained. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The day before the grand bonding ceremony, Lyra had woken before the sun. This was not unusual. She had been waking before the sun for as long as she could remember. Not because anyone required it of her, not because a schedule demanded it, but because the early hours were the only hours that belonged entirely to herself. The palace before dawn was a different place, emptied of its performance, stripped of its hierarchy. Just stone corridors and cold air, and the distant sound of the river running below the eastern wall. In those hours, Lyra could walk without being looked through. She could exist without the specific exhaustion of being invisible in a room full of people. She rose, dressed in the plain gray tunic and dark trousers she wore for healer's ward work, braided her hair without a mirror, and went downstairs. The healer's ward occupied the lowest level of the palace's north wing, a long, low-ceilinged room that smelled of dried herbs and beeswax, and the particular mineral sharpness of the salve she prepared each morning from foraged stoneleaf and winter root. It was not a glamorous assignment. It had been given to her 3 years ago when she first arrived at the palace as a presented Omega candidate, offered as temporary occupation while her status was determined, and it had simply never been reassigned. No one had thought to reassign it. That was, Lyra had come to understand, the nature of invisibility. Not that people wished you gone, but that people simply forgot to wish you anything at all. She worked for 2 hours before the first patient arrived. Old Marin came every morning at the same time, her joints swollen with the cold, her steps careful and deliberate on the stone floor. She was the oldest Omega servant in the palace, perhaps the oldest person in the palace altogether, and she was the only person who greeted Lyra each day by name and waited for an answer when she asked how Lyra had slept. "How did you sleep, little Bloom?" Marin said, settling onto the low stool beside the preparation table with the careful dignity of someone who had long ago made peace with the body's limitations. "Poorly," Lyra said honestly, because she never lied to Marin. "I kept dreaming about flowers." Marin was quiet for a moment while Lyra worked the salve into her hands, the old woman's fingers thin and papery and warm. Then she said, "What kind of flowers?" Lyra hesitated. "The kind I am not supposed to have," she said. Marin made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but held something of both. She said, "The kind that come from you, you mean?" Lyra did not answer. That was answer enough. The warmth was there already, even at this hour, a low pulse in her fingertips where they touched Marin's hands. Something that wanted to rise and open and reach toward the light the way any living thing reached toward the light. She felt it every time she touched someone who was hurting. She felt it most in her feet, in the specific pressure of each step. Like the ground beneath her was listening, and would respond if she only allowed it to. She had spent 15 years not allowing it. She had become so practiced at the suppression that it felt almost like a second skin, the containing of herself. The deliberate smallness, the daily work of making sure her edges did not show. After Marin left, the morning moved through its ordinary rhythms. A young beta guard with a sprained wrist. A kitchen girl with a fever. Two Omega attendants from the upper floors who came together and spoke only to each other and did not acknowledge Lyra beyond extending their arms for examination. Lyra treated them all with the same quiet thoroughness. She did not require acknowledgement to do good work. She had never required it. At midday she ate alone in the ward rather than in the great dining hall. This was a choice she had made early and maintained consistently. The dining hall required navigating tables arranged by rank and designation. Required finding a place in the invisible hierarchy of the unimportant. Required the specific performance of not minding when someone moved their chair slightly away as she sat down. The ward was easier. The ward was hers. She was eating when she felt it, the unbidden warmth rising faster than usual, breaking briefly through the suppression before she caught it and pressed it back down. Her hand was resting on the stone table, and for just a moment, at the base of her smallest finger. A single pale tendril curled upward from a crack in the stone, the beginning of a bloom. She saw it, and her breath caught, and she pressed her palm flat and held it there until the tendril retreated. Her heart was hammering. She sat very still until it slowed. Tomorrow was the grand bonding ceremony. She had been telling herself for weeks that she was prepared, that she had no expectations, that she understood, rationally and clearly, that the bond she felt was not a guarantee of reciprocity, and that a king chose his queen with his politics as much as his heart, and that she was realistic about what she was and what she was not in the mathematics of this court. She had been lying to herself about all of it. She gathered her dishes, returned them to the kitchen, and went back to work. Above her, the palace prepared for tomorrow's ceremony. Below her feet, in the stones of the ward floor, something waited with the patience of a living thing that has learned to hold very still. She did not run. That was the thing Lyra would remember afterward, in the days when she had enough distance to remember anything clearly. She had not run from the grand hall. She had not fled. She had walked, deliberately, one foot placed in front of the other, her spine straight, her breathing controlled, through the great oak doors and down the outer palace steps and along the cobblestone avenue that led from the royal gates toward the city below. She had walked the way a person walks when they have finally put down something very heavy in their body has not yet learned how to move without the weight. The flowers came with her. At first she did not notice them. She was occupied with the strange new sensation of the release, the warmth moving freely through her for the first time in memory, no longer pressed and contained and starved. Simply flowing the way water flows when the dam is gone, finding its own level, following its own nature. It felt enormous. It felt terrifying. It felt, underneath the terror, like the first honest breath she had taken in 15 years. It was the sound that made her look down. A soft collective gasp from somewhere behind her, then another, then a murmur that grew as she walked. As the cobblestones of the palace avenue lit up one by one in the silver white of Solaris Veil flowers blooming in the exact pressure shape of her footsteps. Each bloom the size of her heel or her toe or the ball of her foot, precise and luminous, rising from the stone as though the stone had been waiting for exactly this permission. The avenue behind her glowed like a path drawn by moonlight on solid ground. She stopped walking. She looked back. The trail stretched from the palace gates all the way to where she stood, 50, 60 footsteps of impossible silver flowers, each one perfect. Each one breathing faintly in the night air, as though alive with its own small intention. And they were not wilting. They were not already curling at the edges the way cut flowers curled. They simply existed, radiant and unhurried, as though they had every right to be exactly where they were. A small voice said, "Lady. Lady, look." Lyra turned. A child, a girl, perhaps 7 years old, in the rough linen of a tradesman's family, stood at the edge of the avenue with both hands pressed to her mouth and her eyes enormous. She was staring at the flowers. Then she looked up at Lyra and said, with the absolute directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften wonder into politeness, "They came from your feet." "Yes," Lyra said. Her own voice surprised her, steady, unashamed. "Yes, I think they did." The girl ran forward and knelt beside the nearest bloom, examining it with her nose nearly touching the petals. Then she looked up again. "Are you magic?" Lyra considered this for a moment with more seriousness than the question might have seemed to require. Then she said, "I do not know yet. I am only just finding out." The child smiled at her with all her teeth, and then sprinted away into the dark, shouting something Lyra could not fully hear. Within minutes there were others, a market woman closing her stall who came to look and then simply went still, one hand over her heart. Two young men, who followed the trail backward toward the palace with their torches held low to see the flowers better. An old man in a doorway who watched Lyra walk past, and then bowed his head with the slow, deliberate gravity of someone performing an act they have been saving for the right occasion. Lyra did not know what to do with any of it. She kept walking. She walked through the lower city, past the tanner's quarter and the night market, and the great stone bridge over the Veil River that marked the edge of the royal territory. With every step, a flower. With every flower, the faint silver luminescence that made the path behind her look like a sentence written in a language the ground had always known how to read, waiting only for the right hand to write it. At the bridge she paused. On the other side was the open road. The road that led north to the border forest, and beyond that to Thesvara, the first of the three outer kingdoms, a land she had never seen and had no plan to reach. She had no plan at all. She had only the direction her feet chose, and the warmth moving freely through her, and the flowers rising at every step. On a low stone wall beside the bridge, an elderly scholar sat with a lantern and an open book across his knees. He had been sitting there when she arrived, and he was still sitting there, watching the trail of blooms with an expression of profound and shaking recognition. He said very quietly, "Solaris Veil. I have only ever seen them in the old texts. They bloom only once in a generation. Only for one." Lyra looked at him. "Only for one what?" she asked. He closed his book. He looked at her with eyes gone bright with something between awe and grief. "Only for the one the world has been waiting for," he said. She stood with that for one long moment. Then she crossed the bridge. Behind her, the flowers stretched from the palace gates to the river's edge, glowing silver in the dark, patient as prophecy, permanent as stone. The border forest of Thesvara smelled like pine resin and cold earth, and something older than both, a green, breathing darkness that pressed close on either side of the road and made the sky above the path feel like a kindness rather than a given. Lyra walked through it in the gray hour before dawn, her feet finding the road by feel more than sight. The silver flowers blooming and blooming in the dark behind her like a lantern she was carrying in the wrong direction. She was not thinking about Selim. She was thinking about her mother. This was not unusual. She thought about her mother often in the hours that required the most courage, the way some people reached for a talisman or a prayer. Her mother had been an Omega healer in a small river town 3 days south of the capital, a quiet woman with large hands and a gift for growing things, who had raised Lyra alone after her father's early death, and who had never once, in all the years Lyra could remember, made her feel that being small was the same as being less. Her name had been Senna. She had died when Lyra was 9 years old. The memory arrived the way it always arrived, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once. The way cold water arrived when you stepped into a river. Lyra let it come. She had learned that fighting the memory was more exhausting than walking through it. She had been 9 years old, and her mother had been sick for 6 weeks with the river fever that came every third summer to the lowland towns and took the ones whose bodies could not hold the fight. Lyra had known, in the way that children knew things they were not told directly, that her mother was losing. She had sat beside the bed every day after her lessons and held Senna's hand and tried to be useful in the small ways available to a 9-year-old, fetching water, keeping the compress cool, reading aloud from the books her mother loved. On the last night, she had held her mother's hand and felt the warmth rise in her own chest for the very first time. It had come from nowhere and everywhere at once, a flooding warmth, urgent and enormous, as if every living thing she had ever touched had been storing something on her behalf and was now returning it all at once. She had not understood what it was. She had only known that it wanted to go somewhere, wanted to reach toward her mother. And she had let it go the only way her 9-year-old body knew how. She had pressed both hands flat to the bed, and she had wished with everything she had. The room had filled with flowers. Every surface, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the bedclothes, the windowsill, had erupted in Solaris Veil blooms, silver white and luminous, hundreds of them, thousands, opening all at once in a wave of light so sudden and so complete that the night outside the window had looked dark by comparison. Her mother had opened her eyes. She had looked at the flowers and then at Lyra, and she had smiled with an expression that Lyra had spent the next 15 years trying to fully understand, an expression that held love and recognition and something that might have been relief. Then the door had opened. 3 palace healers who had been called to the town on a circuit visit stood in the doorway and looked at the room and looked at the child kneeling at the bed with her hands pressed flat to the mattress, and their faces had done something that Lyra would never forget. They had gone carefully blank, carefully still, in the way of people who had been trained to manage things that required managing. Her mother had died 3 hours later, the flowers still blooming around her untouched. Afterward, one of the healers, a senior alpha woman with close-cropped gray hair and the particular authority of someone who had never been questioned, had taken Lyra into the hall and crouched down to her level and spoken to her in a low, measured voice. She had said, "What you did in there must never happen again. An Omega who draws that kind of attention is an Omega who will be used or destroyed. Do you understand me? You must learn to hold it in. All of it. Always." Lyra had been 9 years old. She had nodded. She had spent the next 15 years nodding. Now she walked through the border forest of Thesvara in the dark, and she whispered her mother's name, Senna, just once, just quietly, into the cold pine air. The forest floor lit up. Not gradually, not in footsteps, all at once, in every direction as far as she could see through the trees. Millions of Solaris Veil flowers opening simultaneously in a wave of silver light that turned the dark forest into something out of a dream. Something out of the oldest stories, something her mother would have laughed with delight to see. Lyra stood in the center of it and did not press it down. She stood in her mother's light and let it be exactly as large as it was. Above the trees, the sky was beginning to pale toward morning. Behind her, one day's walk away, a king was standing at his palace gates staring at a trail of flowers he did not yet understand and feeling, for the first time in his carefully constructed life, genuinely afraid. Thesvara announced itself with color. After the muted grays and careful browns of the royal territory, the northern kingdom arrived like a conversation spoken at full volume. Terracotta rooftops and saffron-painted market stalls and banners in deep red and gold hanging from every upper window of every building in the border town of Asheville. It was a merchant kingdom, prosperous and proud, with wide cobblestone squares and a culture of open trade that made its people unusually comfortable with strangers. Lyra had read about it once in a geography text in the palace library. In the years when she was filling her quiet hours with anything that kept her mind occupied, she had never imagined she would walk into it with flowers rising from the ground beneath her feet. She arrived in Asheville at mid-morning. The drought had been going on for 11 weeks. She noticed it immediately, in the cracked earth between the cobblestones, in the way the market vendors had arranged their reduced stock to look like more than it was, in the faces of the farmers she had passed on the road into town, who had the particular hollowness of people managing a fear they had been managing for a long time. The fields on either side of the road were withered and pale, the crops low and sparse, the irrigation channels dry and dusty as old bone. She walked through the market square without plan or intention, simply following the direction her feet chose, the way she had been following her feet since the bridge over the Veil River. And the flowers came as they always came now, each footstep blooming silver-white behind her. The Solaris Veil opening in the cracks of the dry earth with a quiet insistence that seemed to say, "Here, and here, and here." What she did not expect was what the flowers did to the earth around them. It began subtly, a darkening of the soil nearest the blooms, a faint returning moisture to the cracked ground, as if the flowers were not merely growing from the earth, but giving something back to it. Then a market woman's potted herbs, set out on a stall table beside the path, straightened visibly and deepened in color as Lyra passed within arm's reach. Then the withered vine growing up the side of the well house in the center of the square put out 3 new green leaves in the span of the time it took Lyra to walk past it. The market went very quiet. She stopped at the well and drew water and drank, because she had been walking since before dawn, and her body required it regardless of what else was happening. She was aware of being watched. She was aware of the silence spreading outward from her position in concentric rings, the way silence spread when something occurred that required a moment of collective reassessment. She drank her water and did not perform anything in particular. She was simply a woman who had walked a long way and was thirsty. Then the village elder arrived. He was a broad man with a white beard and the deeply weathered face of someone who had spent decades reading weather and land. And he walked across the square toward her with the purposeful, unhurried stride of someone who had seen enough of the world to not be easily undone by it. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the flowers at her feet. He looked at the vine on the well house with its 3 new leaves. He looked at her face. He said, "The old texts speak of the Solaris Omega, the one whose steps wake the sleeping earth. We have been reading those texts to our children for 300 years. Lyra looked at him. She said, "I am not sure what I am yet." He said, "I am." And he bowed, a deep, formal bow, one hand pressed to his chest. The kind of bow she had seen performed before kings and high councils and sacred objects. Then he straightened and said, "Whatever you need while you are in Thesvara, you have only to ask." She stayed in Asheville for 2 days. She did not set out to heal the drought. She simply walked, and where she walked the earth remembered what moisture felt like. And the crops along her path thickened and straightened with a quiet urgency that had the farmers following her at a respectful distance with their hands pressed together and their eyes bright. By the second morning, word had traveled ahead of her to the next town. People were lining the road. She was not prepared for that, for any of it, for the way the world received her when she was not trying to be anything at all. She was sitting at the edge of a field on the evening of the second day, her boots off, her feet in the dry grass that was slowly, visibly greening around her, when a scout found her, a young man in the livery of the Thesvaran Border Patrol, breathing hard from a fast ride. He said, "Lady, there is a man at the eastern border crossing. He came alone. No guards, no colors. He says he is following the flower trail." Lyra was quiet for a moment. She said, "What does he look like?" The scout described a tall man with dark hair and the kind of face that people stepped aside for without being asked, wearing plain road clothes that fit too well to be genuinely plain. Lyra looked out across the greening field. She said, "How far behind me is he?" One day the scout said, "Perhaps less." She picked up her boots. She stood. The grass beneath where she had been sitting was a perfect, vivid green. A soft impression of her shape left in growing things. She began walking north. Selim had never been no one before. It was a stranger experience than he had anticipated, not unpleasant exactly, but deeply disorienting. Like walking into a room you have known your entire life and finding all the furniture rearranged in the dark. He had left the palace 4 days after the ceremony, alone, without announcement, wearing the plainest clothes his wardrobe contained, which still managed to look like the plainest clothes a king owned, rather than the plainest clothes a man owned. He had stopped at the first village market and bought a road coat from a stall vendor. A worn brown thing with a fraying collar, and it had helped somewhat. He had told no one where he was going. This was not entirely true. He had told his head steward that he required a week of private travel for matters of personal reflection. A phrase so uncharacteristic coming from him that the steward had repeated it back twice to confirm he had heard correctly. Selim had confirmed it. Then he had walked out of the palace gates and stepped onto the flower trail and begun following it north. The flowers did not respond to him. This was the first thing he noticed, that the Solaris Veil blooms, so luminous and immediate beneath her feet, were entirely indifferent to his. He walked the same cobblestones, the same dirt roads, the same bridge over the Veil River, and the flowers simply sat in her footprints and glowed, and paid him no attention whatsoever. He was a man walking through someone else's story. He was a man following a trail that had not been left for him. He had spent the first day finding this irritating. By the second day, he had understood that irritation was not a useful response to something that simply was what it was. And he had put it aside with the particular discipline of a man who had been trained since childhood to manage his reactions in the presence of things he could not control. By the third day, he had stopped thinking about the flowers' indifference and started thinking about what the flowers themselves meant, which was a more uncomfortable line of thought and therefore more honest. He crossed into Thesvara on the 4th day. The border town of Asheville received him with the mild, professional friendliness of a merchant community accustomed to travelers, a nod from the gate guard, an open market, reasonable prices at the inn. No one bowed. No one stepped aside. A woman with a cart nearly ran over his foot and apologized without particular deference, and then moved on. He stood in the middle of the market square for a moment and experienced the novel sensation of being completely unremarkable. Then he saw the mural. It was on the long south wall of the grain storage building at the edge of the square, still being painted. Two artists on scaffolding working with the focused energy of people who had been commissioned urgently and were taking the commission seriously. It covered the full 2-story height of the wall and depicted a woman in motion, walking, her face turned slightly away and upward. Silver-white flowers rising from the ground at her feet in an arc that curved across the wall like a constellation made terrestrial. She had been painted with the quality of reverence that artists reserved for subjects they believed in, not idealized into unreality, but luminous with a specific, individual truth. Her hands were open at her sides. Her spine was straight. She was not looking back. Selim stood in front of the mural for a long time. A boy of perhaps 10 years appeared beside him, eating something wrapped in paper, and looked up at the mural with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had already decided it was his favorite thing in the square. Selim said carefully, "Who is she?" The boy said, through his food, "The Bloom Sovereign. She came through 3 days ago. She fixed our fields." Selim said, "Fix them how?" The boy gestured broadly at everything around them. "She walked through them." He said it with the tone of someone explaining something obvious. "The crops came back. My father says it has not rained in 11 weeks, but the field looks like it rained last night." Selim looked at the mural again, at the painted woman with her open hands and her trail of impossible flowers, and her face turned away from everything behind her. He said, "What do you know about her? Where she came from?" The boy shrugged. "She came from the south. She does not talk about it much. She talked more about what she was going toward than what she was leaving." He finished his food. Then he said, with the devastating simplicity of a 10-year-old, "Everyone here loves her already. My mother cried when she left, and my mother never cries about anything." Selim was quiet. He paid for a room at the inn. He ate his dinner alone. He sat afterward at the small table by the window and looked out at the market square, where the mural gleamed wetly in the torchlight. The painted flowers still drying, the painted woman still not looking back. He thought about her hands, about how he had never once, in 3 years, looked at her hands. Somewhere ahead of him in the dark, one day's walk north toward the Thesvaran capital. The real woman was sleeping or walking or perhaps not sleeping at all. And the ground beneath her was remembering what it felt like to be alive. He would reach the capital tomorrow. He was 1 day behind her, perhaps less. She felt him before she heard him. This was the nature of the mate bond. It did not announce itself politely. It did not wait for convenient moments. It did not care whether you were ready or prepared, or had specifically decided you were done with the person it connected you to. It simply was, the way gravity simply was, the way the tide simply was. A fundamental pull that operated beneath the level of decision and preference and operated instead at the level of the body's oldest knowledge. Lyra woke in her room at the Thesvaran capital's Travelers Inn at 3 a.m. with the bond, pulling at the base of her sternum, like a hand had closed around something essential inside her, and was tugging, gently but with absolute persistence, in the direction of south. He was close. She lay still and breathed and looked at the ceiling and took inventory of what she felt with the careful honesty she had been practicing since the palace gates. The pull was real, and it was strong, and it carried, underneath its warmth, the particular ache of something unresolved, a note held too long, a question left open. The specific discomfort of a truth that had not yet been spoken aloud between the people it most concerned. She felt all of that. She acknowledged all of that. She did not move toward it. She got up, dressed, and went to the market. The Thesvaran capital was a city of 60,000 people, and on this particular morning it felt as though a significant portion of them had decided the market was the correct place to be. Word of the Bloom Sovereign had traveled faster than she had. She could see it in the way the crowd parted slightly as she entered the great market square. Not with the practiced deference of people performing hierarchy, but with the genuine, slightly odd courtesy of people making space for something they found remarkable. Children pointed. Adults nudged each other. A flower vendor in the third stall she passed simply held out a bundle of dried herbs without asking for payment and said, with a dignity that asked for nothing in return, "For the road, lady. For the long walk." Lyra took it. She said thank you and meant it with her whole chest. She walked through the market, and the flowers came as they always came, each footstep blooming silver white between the cobblestones. Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. And the crowd that had formed along the edges of the square watched with a hush that was not silence exactly, but something richer than silence. The collective held breath of people in the presence of something they recognized as significant without being able to fully articulate why. She had learned in the past days that she did not need to do anything particular to receive this. She only needed to walk without suppressing, to be present without apology, to let the warmth move through her the way it had always wanted to move. That was all. It had always been that simple. It had only ever been the suppression that was complicated. A sick child was brought to her by a desperate mother near the well at the market center. The child was perhaps 4 years old, pale and shivering with a fever that had been climbing for 2 days. And the mother's face held the specific terror of a parent who has been frightened for long enough that fear has become the primary weather of her life. Lyra knelt on the cobblestones without hesitation. She placed her hands on the child's forehead and let the warmth go freely, not commanding it, not directing it, simply allowing it. The way she had allowed it with Marin's swollen hands every morning for 3 years, but with none of the suppression, none of the careful metering. The full warmth. Unrestricted. The child's fever broke within minutes. The mother wept. The crowd, which had been watching at a respectful distance, was very quiet. Then someone began to clap, a single person, then 3, then 30. Then the entire market square in a wave of sound that echoed off the city walls and rose into the morning air like something that had needed to be released. Lyra stood up from her knees, her hands still warm, and the square erupted. She laughed. It came out of her without warning or preparation, a real laugh, unguarded and genuine, surprised out of her by the sheer, improbable joyfulness of the moment, by the child now squirming energetically in her mother's arms, by the flowers blooming across the cobblestones in every direction, as her gift responded to her uncontained joy, by the 60,000 people of this city who had known her for 3 days and were cheering as though she had always belonged here. She laughed, and it felt like the most honest sound she had ever made, clean and bright and entirely her own. The sound carried. It carried across the market square and out through the open city gates and down the broad road that led south from the capital to the border towns, where a man on a road horse had just crested the last hill before the city and pulled his horse to a stop at the sight of the open gates and the flower trail leading through them. He heard her laugh. He had never heard her laugh before. He sat on his horse at the top of the hill, and the sound reached him like something physical. Not the laugh itself by the time it traveled that distance, just the echo of it, the shape of it in the morning air, and he put one hand against his horse's neck to steady himself and stood very still. He had never given her a single reason to make that sound. The understanding of this arrived not gradually, but all at once, landing in his chest with the quiet devastation of something irreversible. He dismounted. He led his horse through the gates on foot. The flowers did not bloom beneath his boots. But he followed them anyway, one step at a time, into the city where 60,000 people had already learned her name. The inn was a modest building on the eastern edge of the Thesvaran capital's market district, 2 stories of warm sandstone with a climbing vine across the front wall that had, sometime in the past 2 days, put out an extraordinary number of new green shoots in defiance of the season. Selim stood outside it in the dark and did not go in. He had found it easily enough. The innkeeper, when he had asked carefully, and without identifying himself whether a woman traveling alone had taken a room here, had looked at him with the assessing directness of a man who had lived his whole life in a merchant city and could read the quality of a question. Then the innkeeper had said, "She is here. She is sleeping. And if you mean her any difficulty, friend, I will point out that there are 40 people in this city who would be very unhappy to hear it, and they all know where this inn is. Selim had said, I mean her no difficulty. The innkeeper had studied him for another moment. Then he had said, then wait outside until morning. She has been walking for 6 days. So Selim waited outside until morning. He sat on the low stone wall across the narrow street from the inn's front door, his road coat pulled against the cold. And he looked at the climbing vine with its impossible new growth, and he thought about 3 moments in time that he had spent 3 years carefully not thinking about. The first rejection had happened 14 months after Lyra arrived at the palace. It had been, in retrospect, almost bureaucratic in its cruelty, which was perhaps the worst kind of cruelty. The kind that did not even extend the dignity of passion or conflict. The kind that simply processed a person the way paperwork was processed. A regional ceremony, a formal review of presented omegas. A list read by an official, while Selim sat on a raised chair at the front of the room, and confirmed or dismissed each name with a nod or a small gesture of his hand. He had gestured her name away. He had been thinking about a trade negotiation with the eastern border houses. He had not looked at her face. He had not looked at her face, and he had moved on to the next item of business, and she had walked out of the room, and he had not thought about it again for a week. He thought about it now, sitting outside her inn in the dark. And the memory had an entirely different quality than it had possessed at the time. At the time it had possessed no quality at all. That was the problem. That was the entire problem, reduced to its smallest and most honest form. The second rejection had been different. That one he had felt. It had been 8 months later, a more formal court ceremony, and she had been standing in a line of 5 presented omegas, and he had walked the line the way protocol required, and when he reached her he had stopped. He had stopped because the bond had hit him, cleanly and unmistakably. A warmth in his chest, and a recognition in some part of him deeper than preference or politics. The specific sensation of something finding what it had been oriented toward. He had looked at her face for the first time. She had looked back at him with calm, searching eyes, not demanding, not pleading, simply present. Simply asking with her whole honest face whether he was going to acknowledge what was between them. He had looked away. He had stepped back. He had continued down the line. He had selected no one that day, which was its own kind of answer. And she had walked out of the hall, and he had spent that evening telling himself stories about political necessity and the requirements of his position, and the difference between what a bond felt like and what a king could afford to choose. He had been lying to himself. He had known it then, and had chosen the lie anyway. Because the lie was familiar, and the truth required a courage he had not yet decided to locate. The third rejection was the one he could not dress in any language that made it acceptable. He had stood on the dais of the grand bonding ceremony with 800 witnesses, and he had announced Seraphine's name, and he had let the official say the words, and then he had turned and looked at Lyra, standing at the end of the aisle in white. Alone, having braided her own hair, and walked there without anyone beside her, and he had said, "You are released from your presentation. You may go." He had told himself her stillness was indifference, that she did not care, that the composed way she breathed and turned and walked out proved that the bond had not been real, or had not been mutual, or had not mattered to her the way it had briefly, shamefully mattered to him before he overrode it with politics. He understood now, sitting in the dark with a climbing vine blooming out of season above the door where she slept, that her stillness had not been indifference. It had been grace. She had given him grace he had not earned, in the moment that required the most of her. And he had watched it walk out of the door and told himself it proved she did not care. He put his face in his hands. He sat like that for a long time in the dark street while the vine put out another shoot above the door. Slow and green and quietly persistent, reaching toward the light even in the absence of it. The way certain things simply could not stop doing what they were made to do. When the sky began to pale, he lifted his head. He still did not know how to speak to Grace. But he was beginning to understand that he would need to learn. Ironmere announced itself with iron. Literally, the border markers were iron posts driven deep into the earth at regular intervals along the road. Each one stamped with the kingdom's crest, a closed fist above a horizontal blade. And each one worn smooth by decades of weather into something that looked less like a symbol of dominance and more like a very old habit. The road itself changed at the border, becoming broader and more precisely maintained. The cobblestones fitted with the particular exactness of a culture that valued engineering as a form of moral statement. Even the trees along the road stood straighter in Ironmere, or perhaps that was Lyra's imagination, shaped by everything she had read about this kingdom in the palace library's geography texts. Ironmere was ruled by Queen Mira, who had been ruling alone for 11 years since her bonded mate's death in a border conflict, and who was by all accounts precisely as formidable as a woman needed to be to hold a militaristic kingdom's loyalty through a decade of male council members who had spent those 10 years waiting for her to prove she could not. She had proved she could. Lyra crossed the border on a Tuesday morning with the Solaris Veil flowers rising from the iron-gray road beneath her feet and the early autumn wind pulling at her hair and the mate bond still humming in her sternum. Quieter now, as though it had accepted that she was not going to turn toward it and had settled into a kind of patient accompaniment. A presence she was aware of the way she was aware of her own heartbeat, always there, never overwhelming, waiting. She had expected Ironmere to be resistant. She had expected the iron-set faces of a military culture to look at a young Omega woman walking alone with flowers at her feet and find her curious at best, a nuisance at worst. She had prepared herself for indifference or suspicion. What she had not prepared herself for was the way the flowers moved through the iron-gray capital city of forest like water through cracked stone, not forcing anything, not demanding anything, simply finding every gap in the hardness and filling it with silver light. She was summoned to the palace on her first afternoon in the city. The messenger who came for her was a woman soldier in full armor who delivered the queen's request. With the crisp professional courtesy of someone who had been specifically instructed to be courteous and was executing the instruction precisely. The request, which both Lyra and the soldier understood to be a summons, was phrased as an invitation to take tea. The Queen of Ironmere did not take tea with petitioners. Lyra followed the soldier through the capital's straight stone streets, the flowers blooming in her wake across the iron-gray cobblestones, and she was aware of the city watching her pass. Not with the open wonder of Thesvara, Ironmere watched with a more contained attention, the specific focus of people who had learned to assess rather than react, who were gathering information before deciding what to feel. She respected that. She understood it. She had spent 15 years doing the same thing. The palace was all gray stone and clean angles and an absence of unnecessary ornamentation that felt less like austerity and more like a very clear statement of priorities. Lyra was shown into a receiving room and left to wait, which she did without anxiety. Examining the room's single piece of decoration, a tapestry on the far wall depicting a woman on horseback leading a column of soldiers through a mountain pass, until the door opened. Queen Mira was not what Lyra had imagined from the texts. She was shorter than expected, with close-cropped silver hair and dark eyes that held an expression of comprehensive assessment that reminded Lyra, with a slight shock of recognition, of herself in the healer's ward, the same quality of attention, the same refusal to perform anything in the presence of something that required genuine engagement. She wore no jewelry. Her hands were calloused. She looked at Lyra the way a person looked at something they had been waiting a long time to see and were now reserving judgment on until they had looked properly. She said, "I expected someone taller." Lyra said, "I get that often." The queen almost smiled. She gestured to a chair. She said, "Tell me about the flowers." And Lyra did. She told it plainly, without embellishment. From her mother's deathbed to the palace gates to the bridge over the Veil River. And the Queen of Ironmere listened without interrupting, without performing sympathy, with the complete and focused attention of someone for whom listening was a practiced skill and not a courtesy. When Lyra finished, the queen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You walked out of a palace that had spent 3 years making you invisible, and the ground lit up beneath you." Lyra said, "Yes." The queen said, "Good." She stood and went to the window, and they both looked out at the courtyard below, where the Solaris Veil flowers had, in the time since Lyra's arrival, spread across the iron-gray stone in an expanding mandala pattern of silver-white, precise and radiant, as though the flowers had decided that the geometry of this courtyard deserved something beautiful and had set about providing it. The queen looked at it for a long time. Then she said quietly, to the window rather than to Lyra, "I have been powerful and lonely for 11 years. She paused. It is extraordinary to see someone who is about to be powerful and not lonely at all. Lyra looked at her. She did not know what to say. She said nothing. The queen turned back to the room. She said, "You will stay in the palace tonight. You will have what you need. And the man following your flower trail will wait at my gates until I decide he may enter." She paused. "He is at the eastern gate now," she said. "He arrived an hour ago and gave his name to the gate guard as Kale. Just Kale." She looked at Lyra steadily. "He has been waiting at my gate for an hour, and he has not demanded entry once." Outside the window the flowers held their mandala pattern in the iron-gray courtyard, silver and patient and precisely arranged, as though they had always known exactly where they were going. Lyra said, "Let him wait." Queen Myra's garden was not what the rest of the palace suggested it would be. The palace was all clean angles and gray stone and the deliberate absence of softness. But the garden tucked behind its eastern wing was something else entirely, a walled enclosure perhaps 30 paces across, laid with old pale stone and containing, in iron-braced planters and carved stone beds, an extraordinary collection of night-blooming plants, things that opened only in darkness, things that had no interest in being seen by the sun and waited instead for the honest hours, the quiet hours, the hours when the performance of the day had ended and only the true things remained. Lyra thought, stepping into it for the first time in the blue hour between sunset and full dark, that she understood exactly why Queen Myra had made this garden. She understood it in her bones. The Solaris Veil flowers had reached the garden before her. They covered the old stone floor completely, edge to edge, silver white and luminous in the gathering dark, their faint glow deepening as the light faded the way stars deepened, not appearing from nowhere, but becoming visible as the competing brightness fell away. Among the iron-braced planters and carved stone beds, the night-blooming plants that had been here before her arrival were now blooming alongside the Solaris Veil in a profusion that should not have been possible in early autumn, as though the presence of the flowers had reminded everything in the garden what it was capable of. Queen Myra was already there, sitting on the low stone bench at the garden's center with a cup of something warm in both hands, looking at the flowers with an expression that had none of the careful assessment of their daytime conversation and all of its underlying depth. She looked, in this garden at night, like a woman who had put down her armor for the first time in 11 years and was noticing how heavy it had been. She gestured to the bench beside her without speaking. Lyra sat. For a while they were simply quiet together, in the way of two people who had each spent a great deal of their lives in rooms where the silence was hostile and had learned to recognize, with gratitude, the silence that was not. Then the queen said, without preamble, "Tell me about the bond." Lyra was quiet for a moment. She looked at the flowers at her feet. She had been asked about the flowers often in the past days, about her gift, about her journey, about the prophecy of the bloom sovereign, but no one had asked about the bond. No one had asked about the specific, personal, ongoing fact of being connected by something indelible to a man who had rejected her 3 times in front of assembled witnesses. She said, "I felt it the first time I saw him, before I understood what it was." The queen said nothing. She waited. Lyra said, "I spent 3 years hoping he would choose it. Not even hoping he would choose me exactly. Hoping he would choose the truth of it. The thing that was real." She paused. "I was very patient. I was patient in the way you are patient when you have decided that patience is the same as worthiness, as though if I waited long enough and was quiet enough and made myself small enough, I would eventually earn the right to be seen." She looked at the flowers. She said, "The third rejection taught me something I could not have learned any other way. It taught me that I was waiting for someone else to name my worth. I was living inside someone else's definition of what I was allowed to be, and I was calling that patience. I was calling it love." She said the word love carefully, not bitterly, simply naming it accurately. But it was not love. It was hope dressed up as love. It was the specific hope of someone who has been told their whole life that their value is conditional. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I will never wait for that again. From anyone." Queen Myra said very softly, "No. I do not think you will." They sat in the flower-covered garden, while the dark deepened around them, and the night-blooming plants opened one by one in the silver light of the Solaris Veil. And the conversation moved to other things, to the Queen's 11 years, to the council members who had spent those years testing her, to what it cost to be powerful in a world that had decided power had a specific face, and that face was not theirs. They talked the way women talked when they had found each other in a place where honesty was safe, with a directness and a completeness that required no performance and no apology. On the other side of the garden wall, a man sat in the narrow service alley between the palace's eastern wing and the garden's outer stone. He had been sitting there for an hour. He had found the alley by following the faint silver glow that leaked through the gap beneath the garden gate. And he had sat down against the wall with his knees up and his head back, and he had listened to every word. He did not move when the conversation ended. He did not move for a long time after the sounds of the garden settled into quiet. He sat in the dirt of the service alley with his back against the cold stone and his eyes looking at nothing, and the full weight of what he had heard arranged itself inside him with the methodical devastation of a truth that has been given the exact right words. She had not been indifferent. She had been hoping. She had been hoping for 3 years, carefully and quietly, in the way of someone who had learned to hope without evidence, because hope was the only thing she had been permitted to keep, and he had taken that too. He had taken the last thing she was holding, and he had not even looked at her face while he did it. Between the stones of the service alley wall, beside his right hand, a single Solaris Veil flower pushed through a crack in the mortar. It was small and trembling and silver white, and it was the first time one had grown anywhere near him without her present. He looked at it for a long time. He did not touch it. The letter arrived at the Ironmere Palace on the 3rd morning. It came in the sealed leather case of the Grand Elder Council's official correspondence, 5 interlocking rings pressed into dark wax, the symbol of the highest governing body of the 5 kingdoms, an authority that had existed for 240 years and had spent most of those years ensuring that the existing order of things remained exactly as it was. Queen Lyra received it at breakfast, read it without expression, and then brought it to Lyra's room herself rather than sending a messenger. This told Lyra everything she needed to know about what the letter contained before she read a single word. She read it anyway. The Grand Elder Council had convened an emergency session 4 days ago, called by Lord Aldrich of House Theron and Lord Vashon of House Cain, the 2 most powerful alpha lords outside the royal bloodline, and the 2 men who had spent the better part of 3 decades ensuring that the law of male-only succession remained the foundational architecture of the 5 kingdoms' governance. The session had produced a formal resolution, written in the careful, ancient language of council law, which amounted to the following. The trail of Solaris Veil flowers had been identified by the council's own scholars as matching the description of the blooms associated with the prophecy of the bloom sovereign. The prophecy, if fulfilled through the completion of the temple ritual at the Sandlands of Dusk, would by its own ancient terms permanently invalidate the law of male-only succession and establish joint sovereign authority as the foundational governance model of the 5 kingdoms. The council had determined that this outcome was destabilizing to the established order and contrary to the interests of the 5 kingdoms' stability. Lyra was to be returned to the capital immediately, for her own protection and the protection of the realm. That was how the letter phrased it, for her own protection. She set the letter down on the table and looked out the window at the courtyard below, where the silver mandala of Solaris Veil flowers still held its precise, radiant pattern across the iron-gray stone. Queen Lyra said, "I have 300 soldiers in this city." Lyra said, "I know." The queen said, "They are yours if you want them." Lyra looked at the courtyard flowers for a long moment. She thought about walking into the Sandlands of Dusk at the head of a column of Ironmere soldiers. She thought about what that image would mean to the council, to the noble houses, to the story that would be told afterward about what kind of woman she was, and how she had arrived at the temple of the first Omega Queen, and what she had needed to get there. She said no. The queen looked at her. Lyra said, "I walked out of the palace alone. I walked through 3 kingdoms alone. I will walk into that temple alone. If I arrive with an army at my back, they will spend the next 300 years saying the ritual was coerced. They will say the flowers were a trick and the temple was taken by force and the bloom sovereign was a political project, not a truth." She paused. "I have come too far to hand them that argument." Queen Lyra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the contained respect of one sovereign acknowledging another, "You think like a ruler." Lyra said, "I think like a woman who has watched how power works from its margins for 15 years. She folded the council letter and set it aside. She said, "But there is one thing I need to know. The letter mentions an envoy dispatched to ensure my return. It does not specify what that means." The queen's expression did not change. She said, "It means an assassin. A very good one, by the council's historical standards." Lyra absorbed this with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She said, "Then I will leave before dawn tomorrow." She did not sleep that night. She sat at the window of her room and watched the courtyard and thought about her mother, and thought about the scholar at the bridge, and thought about the child in the Thesveran market, whose fever had broken under her hands. And she thought about what it meant to be a thing that powerful people wanted to prevent from existing. She thought about all the women before her who had been that thing. She thought about the ones who had been successfully prevented. She thought about the ones who had not been. She was not going to be prevented. At 2 hours past midnight, she heard a sound from the courtyard below, a brief, muffled confrontation, the kind that was over quickly and left only silence afterward. She looked down from the window. In the courtyard, a figure in dark clothes was sitting against the wall with both hands raised in the universal posture of someone who had decided the situation warranted immediate and complete surrender. Standing over the figure, with the particular stillness of a man who had made a decision and executed it without hesitation, was Selim. He was not wearing his road coat. He looked, in the silver light of the courtyard flowers, exactly like what he was, a king who had arrived somewhere ahead of his better self and was trying, with imperfect tools and insufficient preparation, to be useful anyway. The figure on the ground was taken away by palace guards a few minutes later. Selim looked up at the window. Lyra was not certain whether he could see her in the dark. She was not certain whether she stepped back from the glass to prevent it, or did not step back because some part of her had decided, without consulting the rest of her, that she was done disappearing. She stood at the window in the light. After a moment he looked away. He did not come inside. She did not sleep, but she was not afraid. She left before dawn, as she had said she would. The Ironmere capital was at its quietest in the hour before first light, the guard rotations at their longest intervals, the market district empty. The broad stone streets holding only the echo of her footsteps and the silver trail of flowers that rose behind her across the dark cobblestones like a sentence being written in real time. Queen Mira had seen her to the palace gate herself, without ceremony, and had pressed into her hands a small iron compass engraved with the Ironmere crest. She had said, "So you always know which direction is forward." Then she had embraced her, briefly, firmly. The embrace of a woman who understood both the value and the rarity of finding someone worth embracing, and stepped back and let her go. The road south from Ironmere to the Sandlands of Dusk ran through 40 miles of open grassland, before it reached the red rock country that marked the beginning of the Third Kingdom. Lyra had studied the route the evening before, tracing it on a map the Queen's steward had provided, memorizing the waypoints and water sources, and the single mountain pass that had to be crossed before the landscape opened into the vast sand basin of Dusk. It was 4 days of walking at the pace she had been keeping. She was good at walking now. She was good at the specific meditative quality of sustained forward motion. The way the body settled into its rhythm, and the mind either fought it or found its own rhythm alongside it, and she had long since stopped fighting. She was 2 miles south of the capital gates when she heard the footsteps behind her. Not hurrying, not trying to be quiet, simply present, at a distance she assessed to be approximately 30 paces. Maintaining that distance with the deliberate consistency of someone who was making a very clear statement about what they were and were not attempting to do. She kept walking. He kept walking. 30 paces behind her. The same 30 paces. Maintained with the precise consistency of someone who had decided on that distance and was honoring it absolutely. She could not hear the flowers bloom. They were silent. They had always been silent, but she could feel them. The faint warmth of each footstep's release at the edges of her awareness, the gift moving freely and steadily as breathing. She did not look back. The grassland road stretched ahead of them in the gray pre-dawn light, wide and straight and open. The kind of road that offered nowhere to hide from yourself or anyone else. A road for honest travel. She walked it honestly. She did not know whether he was being honest yet. She suspected he was trying. The sun came up. The grassland turned gold around them, and the Solaris Veil flowers behind her caught the early light and became something extraordinary, silver white against the gold grass. The trail stretching back toward the horizon like a river of light, and she thought, not for the first time, what her 9-year-old self would have made of this. What Senna would have made of this. She thought her mother would have laughed, and then wept, and then laughed again, the way joy sometimes came through in layers. They walked through the morning. At midday she stopped at a stream to fill her water skin. She heard his footsteps stop 30 paces behind her. She knelt at the stream and filled the skin, and did not turn around. She was aware of him the way she was aware of the bond, constantly, quietly, without drama. He was there. He had been following for hours. He had not tried to close the distance or speak, or make his presence mean anything other than what it was. A man following the only thing he had left to follow, which was the trail she had not left for him. She stood. She capped the water skin. She began walking again. His footsteps resumed. They walked through the afternoon. An hour before the light began to fail, he spoke. He said her name. Just her name, Lyra, spoken at the same 30 paces, not raised to carry but not withheld either. Spoken at the volume of a man who was saying something he had decided to say and was not going to pretend he had not said it. She stopped. She did not turn around. The grassland held them both in its long gold silence. He said, I am not here to bring you back. She said, I know. You would not have come alone if you were. A long silence. He said, I stopped the assassin last night. There may be others. She said, I know that too. Another silence, longer than the first, filled with the sound of the wind moving through the grass and somewhere distant a bird calling once and not again. He said, I am not asking for anything. She said, good. She began walking. His footsteps resumed, 30 paces behind. They walked like this until the light was nearly gone and the first stars were appearing above the grassland. And then they made separate camps on opposite sides of the road without discussion, as though the arrangement had been agreed upon in advance. As though they were two people who had not yet found the words for what they were to each other, but had arrived at a practical understanding about proximity. She lay in her bedroll and looked at the stars and felt the bond humming in her sternum. Warm and patient, and there, the way it had always been there, waiting. In the morning she rose before dawn. She began walking south. His footsteps joined the road 30 paces behind her within minutes, as though he had been waiting, sitting in the dark on his side of the road, for the sound of her first step to tell him it was time. They walked until the grassland ended. And then she stopped, and he stopped 30 paces behind her, and they both stood at the edge of the sandlands of dusk together. The sand stretched to the horizon in every direction, vast and red gold and ancient beyond any human scale of reckoning. And it was covered, every grain of it as far as the eye could reach, in Solaris Veil flowers, millions upon millions of silver-white blooms stretching from the border markers to the horizon, as though the land itself had spent 300 years preparing for exactly this morning, and had simply been waiting for her footsteps to arrive. Lyra looked at it and could not speak. Behind her, 30 paces back, she heard Selim make a sound she had never heard from him before, something that was not a word, something that came from the part of a person that exists below language. The flowers had been here before either of them. The world had known before he did. The Sandlands of Dusk was the oldest kingdom in the known world. Not the most powerful, not the wealthiest, not the most strategically significant by any measure that the 5 kingdoms' councils and noble houses used to assess significance, but old, genuinely, profoundly old, with a civilization that had been continuous in this place for longer than the other 4 kingdoms had existed combined, built on oral tradition and star reading, and the kind of deep cultural memory that did not require written records because it had never once allowed itself to forget. The Sandlands people remembered things that other kingdoms had turned into mythology. They remembered them as fact, as living knowledge, as instruction that had been passed from keeper to keeper in an unbroken chain of voice and breath and deliberate, loving repetition. They had been keeping the vigil for 300 years. Lyra did not know this as she walked into the first Sandlands city, a place called Oroville that rose from the red sand in towers of pale sandstone and terracotta. its architecture shaped by centuries of wind into curves and arches that looked less built than grown. She did not know about the vigil. She did not know that every generation of Auravel's keepers had added their voice to the chain of remembrance, had spoken the description of the Solaris Veil flowers into the ears of their successors and said, "When you see them, you will know." She did not know any of this. She knew only that the flowers covered the sand in every direction, and that walking through them felt like walking through her mother's name. The city received her in silence. Not the silence of indifference or hostility, the silence of a very large number of people who were doing something that required their full attention and complete stillness. As she passed through Auravel's outer gate, the people lining the street on either side stood with their hands pressed together at their chests and their heads slightly bowed. And the silence they held was the silence of people completing something they had started a very long time ago. There were hundreds of them, then thousands. She walked the main boulevard of Auravel between walls of silent, bowing people, and the flowers rose from the sand at every step, and the air held the quality of a breath being slowly, carefully released after 3 centuries of holding. She kept her face steady. She kept walking. It was the eldest keeper who undid her. The keeper was waiting at the city's central plaza, a woman of extraordinary age. Her face a landscape of deep lines and patient living, her back still straight. Her eyes the particular dark and luminous brown of someone whose inner life had long ago surpassed the need for external validation. She was dressed in the formal white and gold of the keeper's tradition, and she stood in the center of the plaza where the flowers were densest, where they had formed concentric rings of silver white around the ancient well at the plaza's heart. And she waited with the absolute stillness of someone who had been waiting, in one form or another, for all of her life. As Lyra reached the edge of the plaza, the keeper spoke. She spoke Lyra's full name. Not the name Lyra had been called in the palace. Not the shortened, convenient, easily dismissed version of her name that had been used in official presentations and dismissal ceremonies and 3 years of invisible daily life. Her full ancestral name, the complete name, the name her mother had given her. All 4 parts of it, including the ancient designator that connected her lineage to the time before the 5 kingdoms were 5 kingdoms. The name that Lyra had not heard spoken aloud since her mother's death. The name she had not known anyone outside her mother's memory still knew. The keeper spoke it into the morning air of the sandlands of dusk with the care and completeness of someone returning a lost thing to its rightful owner. Lyra stopped walking. The plaza was very quiet. The keeper said, in the common tongue that the whole city could hear, "We have been waiting for you. Not for the Bloom Sovereign. For you specifically by name, by lineage, by the shape of what you carry." She paused. "What you are is not a gift we are giving you today. We are only telling you what has always been true." Lyra stood in the center of the plaza, and the flowers were everywhere, and the people were silent, and the keeper was looking at her with an expression of such complete and unperforming recognition that something in Lyra's chest, something that had been held in a specific tightness for so long she had stopped noticing it as tightness, and had started experiencing it as simply the shape of herself, released. She wept. Not with sound, not with collapse, not with the performance of emotion. She simply stood in the middle of the oldest city in the known world, surrounded by silver flowers and the long faithful silence of a people who had kept a 300-year vigil for exactly this morning. And the tears came down her face quietly and completely, the way rain came after a very long dry season, without drama, without apology. Simply the natural result of something that had been needed for a very long time finally arriving. The keeper came to her and took both her hands in hers. She said very quietly, only for Lyra, "Your mother knew. She knew from the day you were born. She was so proud of you." Lyra closed her eyes. 30 paces back, at the edge of the city's outer gate, a man stood alone in the sand and watched in silence and understood, with a completeness that no amount of pride or politics could soften, that her journey had never been about him. It had always been about her arriving at exactly this plaza, this silence, this woman's hands, this name spoken whole. He had merely been the catalyst for her departure. The understanding did not diminish him. It was simply true. The temple of the first Omega Queen had been carved into the face of the Auravel cliff 300 years before Lyra was born, and it had been waiting, with the specific patience of sacred things ever since. It rose from the red sandstone cliff at the city's eastern edge, not built upward like the temples of the other kingdoms, with their aspirational spires and their architectural arguments about the relationship between humanity and the divine, but carved inward into the cliff itself, as though whoever made it had understood that true depth did not reach toward the sky but pressed into the earth, into the bone of the world, into the oldest and most honest places. The entrance was a single doorway, precisely human-sized, flanked by carved figures of women with their hands open at their sides and their faces turned slightly upward. 300 stone steps led from the city plaza to the doorway, cut into the cliff face with a precision that had not eroded in 3 centuries. Each step wide enough for one person walking alone. The Solaris Veil flowers covered every step. Lyra stood at the base of the staircase in the early afternoon light and looked up at the 300 steps rising into the cliff face and the dark doorway at the top and felt, underneath the enormity of the moment, something unexpectedly simple. Not fear, not the specific paralysis that came with things that were too large to approach directly. Something simpler and older than either of those. The feeling of a person who has been walking towards something for a very long time and has finally arrived at the place where the walking ends and the arriving begins. She began to climb. The keeper had offered to accompany her. Lyra had said no with gratitude, and the keeper had received the refusal with the dignity of someone who had expected it. The city of Oroville watched from the plaza below as she climbed, the silence they had held since her arrival deepening as she ascended, becoming something that was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of collective intention, thousands of people holding their breath in the same direction, sending something wordless and essential upward with her. She climbed steadily. At the 150th step, the midpoint, she paused and looked out over Oroville and the sandlands stretching beyond it to the horizon, and the sea of silver Solaris Veil flowers covering the sand in every direction blazed in the afternoon sun like a second sky laid flat against the earth. She looked at it and breathed and kept climbing. At the 273rd step, she became aware that the flowers beneath her feet were responding differently than they had anywhere else on the journey. Not simply blooming, glowing actively, with a warmth and luminescence that she could feel through the soles of her boots, as though the stone of the cliff itself was alive with something that recognized her approach and was rising to meet it. She reached the doorway. She crossed the threshold. The temple interior was a single chamber, roughly circular, perhaps 20 paces across, with a ceiling that curved upward into darkness and walls carved from floor to ceiling in the ancient script of the Sandlands keepers, not decorative, not symbolic in the distant, interpretive way of most sacred architecture, but precise. Instructional, the kind of writing that meant to be read and understood and used. She could not read all of it. She could read enough. At the chamber's center was the altar. It was a low flat surface of pale sandstone, perhaps waist height, its surface worn smooth by 3 centuries of hands and offerings, and the specific reverence of people who had tended something sacred through the long years of waiting. In the center of the altar's surface, surrounded by carvings that her gift recognized before her mind did, she felt the warmth in her hands surge toward them the way warmth surged toward cold. Filling a gap were 2 handprints, side by side, carved into the stone. A space for 2 hands. Waiting. She approached the altar. She placed her hands in the carved impressions. The temple filled with light. It was not a dramatic explosion, not a violent or sudden thing. It was an opening. The way a door opened, the way dawn opened, gradual and inevitable and complete. The carvings on the walls lit from within. The ancient script illuminating in silver white from the floor upward in a slow wave that revealed, as it climbed, the full text of the first Omega Queen's founding covenant, a document that the scholar world had believed lost, that the Grand Elder Council had claimed never existed, that the keepers of the Sandlands had been reciting from memory for 300 years and now blazed in undeniable, permanent light on the walls of its origin. Lyra's bloomsong gift erupted. Not the gentle blooming of the footsteps, not even the full forest illumination of the Thesvaran border, something beyond those, something that used every living thing within reach as its instrument. The flowers on the temple steps, the flowers on the cliff face. the flowers covering the sand of the sandlands in every direction. All turned simultaneously to face the temple doorway. The light that came from them converged. The cliff face blazed. The city below lit up as though a second sun had arrived from the east. Lyra stood at the altar with her hands in the carved impressions, and her eyes closed and the warmth moving through her in waves so large and so complete that the boundary between herself and the gift had dissolved entirely. She was not channeling it. She was it. She had always been it. The suppression had never diminished it. It had only been waiting for her to stop being afraid of its size. Outside, on the 300 steps below the temple doorway, Selim had been climbing. He had not planned to climb. He had been standing at the base of the steps with the rest of the city, watching her ascend. And then the light had begun, and something in the bond had pulled with an urgency that bypassed decision entirely. And he had been climbing before he had consciously chosen to climb. He reached the temple doorway as the light peaked. He stood in the entrance and looked at her, at Lyra, standing at the ancient altar with her hands in the carved stone, and silver light pouring from her in waves that moved through the air like sound. And the bond slammed through him with the full force of everything he had been managing for 3 years, and ignoring for 2, and following for 2 weeks across 3 kingdoms. And it drove him to one knee on the temple threshold. Not theater. Not the performed humility of a king in a ceremony. The honest, involuntary, structural response of a man whose entire architecture of self-deception had just been disassembled by the sight of the woman he had rejected 3 times, standing in the full, uncontainable truth of what she was. He knelt on the threshold of the temple, and the flowers on the steps around him blazed silver, and he did not look away from her for a single moment. The light held for a long time. When it faded slowly, the way the best things faded, not diminishing but settling, becoming part of the permanent quality of the air in this place, as though the temple had absorbed what it needed and would carry it forward in its stones. Lyra lifted her hands from the altar. She turned. She saw him kneeling in the doorway. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that held everything she had felt and suppressed and released and carried across 3 kingdoms, and then she said, quietly and clearly, "Get up. What comes next requires you standing." He stood. Outside, the sandlands blazed silver to the horizon. They came down the 300 steps together. Not side by side, she walked ahead and he followed, the same arrangement as the grassland road. The same 30 paces of honest distance, except that now the distance felt different. Not the distance of avoidance or unresolved anger. The distance of 2 people who understood that some things needed to be arrived at in the correct order, and that the correct order required patience. She had become very good at the right kind of patience. The kind that was not self-erasure. The kind that was simply the wisdom of knowing when the moment had not yet fully arrived. The moment had not yet fully arrived. It would arrive soon. The representatives of the Grand Elder Council were waiting at the base of the steps. There were 7 of them, formal envoys from 5 of the noble houses, 2 carrying the sealed documentation of the council's resolution, all wearing the deep blue of official council business, all arranged in the precise formation of people who had rehearsed this moment and had a very clear plan for how it was going to proceed. They had arrived in Oroville that morning on fast horses, a day ahead of what their own schedule had projected, driven by the light that had blazed from the cliff face and been visible, according to the lead envoy's barely concealed alarm, from 30 miles away. They had also brought Lord Aldrich of House Theron himself. He was a large man, white-haired and sharp-eyed, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent 70 years being the most important person in every room he entered and had arranged his entire sense of self around the continuation of that condition. He stood at the front of the council delegation with the documentation in his hand and an expression that was trying to be authoritative and was achieving something closer to a man standing in front of a tide and reminding it of the rules. The entire city of Oroville was watching from the plaza. Lyra descended the last step. She stood on the plaza floor in the afternoon light with the sand city at her back and the cliff temple above her and the Solaris Veil flowers covering every surface in every direction. And she looked at Lord Aldrich and the council delegation, and she felt something she had not felt in any of the 3 moments she had stood before power and been dismissed. She felt no fear at all. Lord Aldrich stepped forward, He held up the documentation. He began to speak in the formal cadences of council resolution, the established order, the stability of succession law, the procedural requirements for validating prophetic claims, the council's authority to determine the legitimacy of ritual outcomes, the importance of returning to the capital for proper review. Lyra waited until he had finished. Then she spoke. She did not speak loudly. She had learned something on this journey about the relationship between volume and authority, that they were not the same thing, that genuine authority did not require volume, that the voice that carried furthest was not always the one raised highest, but the one speaking from the place where the truth lived. She spoke at a normal conversational volume, clearly, without tremor, and the plaza was so completely silent that every word reached the city walls. She said, "For 300 years, the law of male-only succession has told half of the 5 kingdoms that their voices are decorative, that their gifts are liabilities, that their worth is conditional on someone else's willingness to name it." She paused. "I know this law intimately. I lived inside it for 15 years. I was told as a child that my gift would get me used or destroyed, and I believed it. And I spent 15 years making myself small enough to survive in the space that law left for someone like me." She looked at the council delegation. She said, "The temple of the first Omega Queen did not choose me today. It recognized me. There is a difference. Choosing implies that the outcome was uncertain, that it could have gone another way, that the institution holds the power to confer or withhold. Recognition implies that the truth existed before the institution arrived to witness it and will exist after the institution has finished arguing about it." She took one step forward. She said, "I walked through 3 kingdoms without an army, and without a title, and without a single credential that this council would recognize as legitimate. And everywhere I walked, the ground remembered what it was capable of. The drought-withered fields of Thesvara remembered. The iron-gray courtyards of Ironmere remembered. The sand of the Sandlands remembered for 300 years without being asked." She said, "You sent someone to stop me from arriving here." The silence that followed this sentence was very specific. Several of the council envoys became carefully still in the way of people who had been hoping that particular fact was not going to be named publicly. She said, "I am naming it." Lord Aldrich opened his mouth, and Selim stepped forward. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her, not between her and the council, but beside her. His shoulder at her level, his presence simply added to hers without diminishing or redirecting it. He looked at Lord Aldrich with the specific expression of a king who had been performing kingship for a long time and had recently located the difference between the performance and the thing itself. He said, "She speaks for me as well. Every word." Lord Aldrich closed his mouth. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any silence the plaza had held before, not the held breath of anticipation or the quiet of reverence, but the specific, loaded silence of history recognizing that it has just turned a corner and is now facing a direction it cannot turn back from. Every Solaris Veil flower on the temple steps turned toward Lyra. Every single one, simultaneously, as though they had been listening. The council envoys looked at the flowers. Then they looked at Lyra. Then one by one, beginning with the youngest and ending with the oldest, they bowed. Lord Aldrich did not bow. But he did not speak again either. And in the long, silver-lit silence of the Sandlands afternoon, that was enough. They returned to the capital in 17 days. Not hurrying, not performing urgency or triumph. Lyra set the pace, steady, unhurried. The same pace she had maintained across 3 kingdoms, and the entourage that had assembled around her by the time they left Oravel simply adjusted itself to her rhythm. The keeper of the Sandlands sent 2 scholars. Queen Mira sent 3 advisors. The village elder of Asheville in Thesvara had somehow learned of the return journey and appeared at the border with a written account of the drought's healing that he pressed into Lyra's hands with the gravity of a man submitting evidence. The council envoys traveled a day ahead, which suited everyone. Selim traveled beside her now. Not 30 paces behind. Beside, though they had arrived at beside gradually, by increments so small that neither of them could have identified the precise moment the distance changed. One morning on the road from the Sandlands she had paused at a stream, and he had paused alongside her without thinking. And she had looked at him and said nothing, and he had said nothing. And they had both looked at the water for a while. And when they continued walking, he was beside her, and that was simply how it was after that. They did not talk about the rejections on the road. They talked about other things, the governance structures of the three kingdoms they had passed through, the specific mechanisms of the drought recovery in Thesvara, what the first Omega Queen's covenant, blazing on the temple walls, meant for the legal interpretation of succession law, the children at the Ironmere Gate who had collected Solaris Veil flowers into small bundles and pressed them into Lyra's hands. They talked carefully and substantively, and without performance. And Lyra found that she could do this, that she could be beside him, in conversation with him, without losing the thread of herself. She had been afraid, in some unexamined part of her, that proximity to him would undo the clarity she had found on the road. It did not. She had become too entirely herself for his presence to reshape her. That, she understood, was the gift beneath the gift. The capital received them on a gray October morning. The palace gates stood open. The city streets were lined. Not with the orchestrated ceremony of official arrivals. There had not been time to organize that, and Lyra had specifically declined the offer when it was made by the head steward, who had ridden out to meet them 2 days from the city, and had seemed both relieved and deeply uncertain about which protocols applied to a situation that had no historical precedent. The people who lined the streets had come of their own accord, drawn by the news that had traveled faster than the entourage, by the stories from Thesvara and Ironmere and the Sandlands, by the flower trail that had never wilted and was still visible on the palace avenue in perfect, luminous preservation from the night Lyra had walked out. She walked back in on the same flowers she had left on. This was not planned. It simply happened that way. The Grand Elder Council's first formal session since the Oravel confrontation was convened 3 days after her return. In the great council chamber at the palace's heart, a room she had never entered before. A room she had walked past hundreds of times in 3 years of invisible daily life without once being asked inside. She entered it now and sat at the table, and the council members arranged around it looked at her with a range of expressions that ran from genuine open readiness to barely managed resentment. And she looked back at all of them with the same steady, prepared attention. She was very prepared. She had spent 15 years watching how power worked from its margins, learning its structures and its pressure points and the specific places where its logic was self-contradicting, storing the knowledge the way a person stored provisions for a journey they knew was coming. She had been preparing for this room for 15 years without knowing that was what she was doing. She placed her hands flat on the council table. She said, "I am proposing the Solaris Accord. 3 changes. I will explain each one clearly, and I will answer questions, and I will hear objections. Because governance built on silenced objections is governance that collapses when the silencing stops." She looked around the table. "But I will tell you now, before we begin, that these 3 changes are not negotiable in their essence. Their implementation can be discussed. Their substance will not be." She presented the first change. Omega voices counted equally in all succession determinations and governance appointments, effective immediately, across all 5 kingdoms, with enforcement mechanisms written into the Council's founding charter. Lord Vashan of House Kane objected immediately, with the well-prepared argument of someone who had been constructing it for days. Tradition. Stability, the unproven nature of the Bloomsong gift as governance qualification. The risks of rapid structural change to established systems. Lyra let him speak. She listened to every word with genuine attention. Then she said, "Lord Vashan, in the 11 years that Queen Mira has governed Ironmere alone, following the death of her bonded mate, has the kingdom's stability increased or decreased?" A pause. "Increased," said one of the younger council members, before Vashan could respond. "Significantly. By every measurable indicator." Lyra said, "Thank you." She looked at Vashan. "I am not arguing against tradition. I am pointing out that the tradition you are defending is not as old as the one I am restoring." She presented the second change, mandatory recognition of designation-independent gifts in all palace appointments and official positions, meaning that an individual's designation as Omega, Beta, or Alpha could not be used as the sole determining factor in their eligibility for any governance role. She presented the third change, the creation and royal funding of a sanctuary and academy for gifted Omegas across all 5 kingdoms, to be built on protected land adjacent to each kingdom's capital, to provide education, safety, and the specific environment required for gifts like Bloomsong to be developed rather than suppressed. When she said this last one, she thought about herself at 9 years old in the hall outside her mother's room, being told to hold it in. She thought about every version of that 9-year-old that had existed in the generations before her. She thought about the ones being born right now, in small towns and river villages and palace servant quarters, who would grow up pressing their warmth down and calling the suppression survival. Not anymore. The arguments continued for 4 hours. She answered every one. At the end of the 4th hour, Selim called for a vote. He voted first. Yes. Queen Myra's advisor voted. Yes. The Thesvaran representative voted. Yes. The younger council members voted. Yes, yes, yes. Lord Aldrich abstained. Lord Vashon abstained. 2 others abstained. No one voted against. The Solaris Accord passed. Lyra placed her hands on the table, and the silver flowers bloomed across the wood from her fingertips to the table's edges in a slow, radiant wave, covering the ancient surface in living light. And the council chamber held a silence that was not the silence of suppression or compliance or carefully managed invisibility. It was the silence of something that had been wrong for 300 years being set right. It was the silence of the ground remembering what it was capable of. Lyra designed the coronation herself. This was not traditional. The coronation of a joint sovereign had not occurred in 300 years, and the palace's master of ceremonies, a meticulous beta man named Orin, who had spent 40 years perfecting the choreography of royal occasions, and possessed an almost physical distress in the presence of procedural uncertainty, had arrived at her door the morning after the Solaris Accord passed with 3 leather-bound volumes of historical coronation protocol and the expression of someone who had not slept. She had invited him in, offered him tea, listened to him outline 6 possible ceremony formats with the focused patience of a woman who had once spent 3 years being overlooked by people in rooms exactly like this. And then she had said, kindly and clearly, "Thank you, Orin. I would like to do something different." She had spent 2 evenings planning it. The coronation would be held outdoors at dawn, in the great courtyard of the palace. Not the grand hall with its 800 candles and its hierarchical seating arrangements and its architecture of spectacle. The courtyard, open to the sky, where the morning light came in level and honest and fell on everyone equally. The guest list would not be drawn from the noble houses and the council chambers. Invitations would go to representatives from every village, every market town, every community that had sent someone to line the road when she returned. The farmer from Asheville whose fields had greened along her path. The mother from the Thesvaran capital whose child's fever had broken. The Iron Queen herself, who had arrived in the capital 4 days ago and had taken up residence in the East Wing with the self-possessed comfort of a woman who went where she determined she needed to be and found the accommodations adequate or improved them. The Sandlands keeper had traveled 17 days to be here. She stood in the front row of the courtyard at dawn, her white and gold keeper's robes luminous in the early light, her ancient face holding the expression of a vigil completed. The courtyard was carpeted entirely in Solaris Veil flowers. They had appeared overnight, not planted, not arranged, simply present, as though the ground beneath the palace had been quietly deciding for weeks that this morning was the morning and had prepared accordingly. They covered every stone, every drain, every worn edge of every step, wall to wall and corner to corner. A complete living carpet of silver white that in the pre-dawn dark had glowed so brightly that the palace staff had come out at midnight to look and had stood there until the cold drove them back inside. In the first light of dawn the courtyard looked like a piece of sky that had fallen gently to earth and decided to stay. Lyra stood at the courtyard's center in the dress she had chosen herself, not white, not the white of presented Omegas or the formal white of ceremonies designed by other people for other purposes. Deep green, the color of the first new growth in the Thesvaran fields. The color of the vine across the Iron Miran's front wall putting out shoots in defiance of the season. The color of the grass greening around her feet on the open road. Her hair was braided by her own hands, as it had always been. Selim stood beside her. He wore midnight blue as he always wore, but without the chain of sovereignty across his chest. He had left it on his dressing table that morning, deliberately. Because the chain belonged to the performance of kingship, and this morning was not a performance. He looked, without it, like a man rather than a king. And Lyra thought that this was a better thing to be crowned as. The ancient crown from the temple of the first Omega Queen had been brought from Oravel by the keeper herself, carried in a sandalwood case for 17 days of travel. It was not what Lyra had expected when she heard the word crown, not the imposing architecture of gold and precious stones that sat in the royal treasury's display cases. It was a circlet, simple and elegant, of pale silver-white metal that matched the exact color of the Solaris Veil flowers, set with 2 stones side by side at its center, one the deep blue of the night sky, and one the luminous white of dawn. Made for 2, as the keeper had told her. Always meant for 2. Before the keeper raised the crown, Selim turned to Lyra. He had asked for this moment, one private minute within the public ceremony. Just the 2 of them facing each other in the middle of the flower-covered courtyard, while the assembled guests held a respectful silence. She had granted it because she understood that some things needed to be said aloud, in front of witnesses, to become real. He said, "I am not asking to be forgiven." She looked at him steadily. He said, "Forgiveness is something I have to earn through years, not request in a moment. I know that. What I am asking, what I want to ask, is for the chance to spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of standing next to you. Not in front of you, not above you, next to you." He paused. "I have been following your trail for 3 weeks, and I have watched 3 kingdoms bow to the ground you walked on. And I understand now that I was never the center of this story. I was the obstacle you had to leave behind to find out who you were." He held her gaze. "I would like, if you will allow it, to stop being the obstacle. To become instead someone who is useful to what you are building." Lyra looked at him for a long time. The courtyard was very quiet. The flowers were very still. She thought about 3 years of careful hope and 3 public rejections, and 6 days of walking alone through the world with her gift blazing freely behind her, and the extraordinary, improbable joy of discovering that the world was full of people who would see her and love what they saw. She thought about the 9-year-old told to hold it in, and the woman who had finally, irrevocably let it go. She thought about what it meant to share a crown with someone, not to give them half of what she was, but to stand beside them as the complete and entire version of herself and ask that they do the same. She said, "You followed my flowers across 3 kingdoms alone." He said, "Yes." She said, "You stopped the assassin in the dark without telling me until the morning." He said, "Yes." She said, "You stepped forward at the temple steps and told the council I spoke for you." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Those were not the actions of a man performing worthiness. Those were the actions of a man who had stopped performing and started being." She looked at him. She said, "I am not forgiving the past today, but I am choosing the future." She took his hand. The courtyard exhaled. The flowers did not bloom for him. They had not bloomed for him yet. And she understood that would be a long and gradual thing, if it came at all. The gift's own reckoning operating on its own timeline. But they leaned toward him, just slightly, just perceptibly. The nearest blooms bending a fraction of an inch in his direction. The way flowers leaned toward warmth when warmth was genuinely offered. The keeper raised the ancient crown. She placed it on Lyra's head first, gently with both hands, with the complete deliberate care of someone completing the final act of a 300-year vigil. Then, at Lyra's nod, she placed it on Selim's head. The same circlet spanning both of them for a moment like a bridge between 2 shores, before resting finally between them as the symbolic thing it was, the acknowledgement that what was being crowned today was not a hierarchy but a partnership. Not a continuation of the old order, but the first morning of a different one. The dawn light came over the palace wall and fell into the courtyard, and the Solaris Veil flowers blazed silver white in the first sun, and the assembled guests, farmers and market women, and village elders and soldiers, and the Iron Queen, and the ancient keeper and Marin. Old Marin, who had asked every morning how Lyra had slept and waited for the answer, all of them together in the flower-covered courtyard under the open sky, broke into sound. Not polite applause. Not the choreographed response of a formal ceremony. Something from the chest. Something real. The sound of people who had seen the long walk and were genuinely, freely glad that it had ended here. Lyra stood in the dawn light with the crown on her head and Selim's hand in hers, and the flowers everywhere, and the sound rising around her, and she felt, for the first time in her life, the specific sensation of being exactly the right size. Not too small. Not pressed down or contained or carefully metered. Exactly the size she had always been, finally in a world that had made enough room. 5 years after the coronation, the Bloomsong Sanctuary and Academy opened its doors for the first time on a Tuesday morning in early spring, and 43 children walked through them. They came from everywhere. From the river towns of the south where Omega gifts had been suppressed for so long that the children who carried them had learned to flinch when their hands grew warm. From the merchant cities of Thesvara, where a girl had been growing wildflowers from stone walls since she was 4, and her parents had brought her to the capital the moment the Academy's founding was announced because they had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for exactly this place. From the border villages of Ironmere, where Queen Mira had personally identified 3 children with gifts that the old order would have called dangerous and the new order called extraordinary. From the Sandlands of Dusk, where the keeper had sent 7 children with her blessing and a letter that Lyra read twice and then pressed to her chest and held there for a long moment. From small places and quiet places and invisible places. From the margins where the light had been living all along. The Academy sat at the edge of the palace grounds on a long low hill that caught the morning sun first and held it longest. A complex of warm sandstone buildings arranged around a central garden that had not needed to be planted because the ground had simply bloomed when the foundation stones were laid. It was a practical place as well as a beautiful one, classrooms and workshops, and a healer's ward better equipped than the one Lyra had worked in for 3 years. A library that had been built around the texts recovered from the temple of the first Omega Queen, and was already the most comprehensive collection of designation-independent gift scholarship in all 5 kingdoms. Dormitories with windows that faced the garden, beds that were not the smallest in the building. Lyra walked through the Academy garden every morning. The flowers followed her still. 5 years and 3 children later, and the Solaris Veil still rose from the ground at each footstep. Still glowed faintly silver in the early light, still refused to wilt or fade. She had stopped being surprised by this. She had started being grateful for it in a different way than she had been grateful before, not with the rawness of new discovery, but with the deep, settled gratitude of someone who had lived long enough with a gift to understand it as simply the most honest expression of what she was. She and Selim had 2 daughters and 1 son. The eldest daughter, Senna, named without discussion. Selim had suggested it the morning after the birth, and Lyra had not been able to speak for a full minute, was 4 years old, and had inherited her mother's warmth in full, flooding measure. She made flowers bloom when she laughed. She made them bloom when she cried. She made them bloom when she was sleeping. Small silver-white Solaris Veil blossoms appearing on the bedclothes around her dreaming form. And the nursery attendant had stopped being startled by this after the first week, and had started simply leaving extra space around her in the bed. Senna had no idea this was unusual. She had never been told to hold it in. This was the thing Lyra considered most important that she had ever done. More than the Solaris Accord. More than the council vote. The simple, daily, absolute refusal to tell her daughter that her light was a liability. The second daughter, Mira, named with the Iron Queen's knowledge and clearly visible pleasure, was 2 years old and had not yet manifested a gift with any clarity, which Lyra and Selim treated with complete equanimity, and the palace staff treated with a kind of collective anxious hope that Lyra found both touching and unnecessary. The boy, the youngest, was 7 months old and spent most of his time being passed between his parents and Marin, who had refused to retire and who had recently informed the head steward that she intended to outlive everyone in the palace through sheer determination, a claim the head steward had wisely declined to contest. The Equal Sovereign Council met 4 times a year now in the great council chamber, where the flowers Lyra had grown across the table on the day of the Accord vote had been preserved under glass as part of the room's permanent installation, a decision made by the council members themselves, without her suggestion, which had pleased her more than she had expected. 3 of the original hostile lords had been replaced by their successors. The successors were younger. 2 of them had Omega children. One of them had come to Lyra privately in her first month on the council and said, with the careful honesty of someone who had done a great deal of thinking, "I owe you an accounting of what my house has done." She had said, "Begin it then." And he had. The Solaris Veil flower had been formally designated the symbol of the 5 Kingdoms' new charter, replacing the closed-fist crest of the old order with a bloom that split stone and survived drought and asked nothing of the ground it grew from except permission. The new charter was 47 pages long. Lyra had written 11 of them herself, in the night hours after the children were sleeping, at the same desk where she had once prepared healer's salve from foraged stoneleaf and winter root and eaten her midday meal alone. On this particular Tuesday morning in early spring, she walked through the academy garden at the hour when the light was new and the air still held the night's cold and the dew was on everything. And she moved between the rows of blooming things with the unhurried ease of a woman who had nowhere more important to be than exactly here. She rounded the corner near the garden's eastern wall and stopped. A child was standing in the middle of the garden path. She was perhaps 6 years old, small and dark-haired, wearing the academy's simple gray tunic with her sleeves pushed up past her elbows, standing very still in the middle of the path with both hands pressed flat against the air in front of her, as though she was trying to hold something steady that kept wanting to escape. Her face held the specific expression of someone in the grip of intense concentration, attempting to manage something much larger than themselves. At her feet, in the path's packed earth, a Solaris Veil flower was growing. It was tiny, smaller than a thumbnail, trembling faintly, the petals barely open. Silver white and impossibly fragile against the dark soil. It had grown in the print of the child's left foot, the exact pressure shape of her small heel and toes. The same way Lyra's had grown for the first time on the marble floor of the grand hall on the night she had stopped holding herself back. The child was staring at it with enormous eyes. She did not know Lyra was there. She whispered to the flower, "Stay. Please stay." And the flower stayed. Lyra stood very still and watched the child and the flower, and felt something move through her chest that was not the Bloomsong gift, and was not the bond, and was not grief or joy exactly, but was the thing that lived underneath both of those, the deep, structural rightness of a life that has been lived in the direction of what it was made for, the feeling of a door opened rather than closed, the feeling of an ending that was also, unmistakably, a beginning. She took one step forward. A Solaris Veil flower bloomed in her footstep. The child heard it, the faint whisper of something living opening from the earth, and looked up. She saw Lyra. Her eyes went wide. Then she looked down at the flower in Lyra's footstep and back up at Lyra's face and said, with the enormous seriousness of a 6-year-old arriving at an important conclusion, "You have them too." Lyra knelt down to look at the child's flower. It was perfect. Small and trembling and completely, entirely itself. She said, "I do. I have had them my whole life." The child said, "Were you scared of them?" Lyra looked at the flower for a moment. She thought about a 9-year-old in a palace corridor being told to hold it in. She thought about 15 years of careful suppression and the specific exhaustion of containing your own light. She thought about a marble floor and a bridge over a river and a border forest blazing silver in the dark. She said, "Yes. For a very long time, I was scared." The child considered this with great seriousness. Then she said, "What happened?" Lyra looked at her. She smiled, the same unguarded, genuine smile that had escaped her in the Thesvaran market on the morning the whole city cheered. The smile that had carried on the morning air to a man on a hillside who had never heard her laugh. She said, "I walked through the fear, one step at a time, and every step I took, something beautiful grew." The child looked down at her own small flower, still trembling, still staying. Then she looked up at Lyra with the complete, clear-eyed trust of someone who has just been given the most important piece of information of their life and knows it. She said, "Will you teach me?" Lyra took her hand. She said, "That is exactly why I am here." Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.